Hey guys, this is James here from 4X Alchemist. It has been a long time, but I am back here with Endless Space 2 with the new Vaulters expansion that has recently come out. I've taken a pretty long break from the game along with my brother David, and yeah, just sat down over the last couple of days to kind of get back into it, get a little bit caught up, and was having a good time. So figured it might be time to come back, and as long as I was playing a little bit more, I figured I would make a video, because it's been really fun engaging with you guys in this community since we started doing this last year when the game was a bit newer. So, to kind of get caught up here, I'm going to just kind of do a bit of a stream. I'm a little bit new to some of these things as well, although I did play a couple of practice games, but just kind of keeping up on things. I'm going to play one of the old races, the Lumeris, for this first stream to kind of get caught up on the core mechanics that have been different, and then I will probably dive into the Vaulters that are here, the new race, a bit later. So if you guys have watched the channel before, you know that my favorite race is the Lumeris, and so I'm going to dive in here to a Lumeris game, and we'll talk a little bit about what's different first, and then we'll go on and play the game and see how it goes. As usual, I'm going to play 10 competitors, endless difficulty, endless pirate difficulty, so that one's kind of new. They've upped the mechanics surrounding the pirates a lot, so I'm going to be interested to see where that goes. Yeah, no turn timer, no unique random civilizations, and as before we have economic victory off. So this is mostly the same. Medium galaxy density with few constellations, a huge one with a random shape, and 10 total competitors, all on endless difficulty, normal speed. Alright, so let's dive in and talk a bit about what's different first. So I have made a made a little cheat sheet for myself about the 5 things that I want to talk about that are different. So I'm just going to leave this up on the screen for a second. And I've kind of ranked these in what I think are the order of impact on the game. So I'll just kind of like talk about these here, and then we can make this even like a little standalone kind of update for those of you who, like me, haven't played this game in a while. And then we'll dive in and encounter the differences of some of these systems as we come to them. So the first and biggest change is this one: the changes to approval for both population and for systems. So let's take those in turn. It used to be in Endless Space that when you had a planet, like this atoll, let's say, the atoll would give you a certain approval bonus or penalty based upon the type. And so I think for atolls and Terrans, and kind of what we call the Tier 0 planets, so atoll, Terran, jungle, jungle, ocean, they like gave +5 or something like that. And for, toxic ones, the really nasty things, it would give like a -20, and it would be a set penalty for as long as you had colonized that planet, you would get a negative impact. And they changed that recently to have it be a negative impact per population actively working that planet. So now we could colonize this toxic, and instead of getting a broad, a broad -20 to our population, we would instead have, right down here, this -8 approval in the lower left-hand corner that you can see per population actively working the planet. On top of that, there are some additional penalties for having high populations on planets. So you see this red bar here that triggers an overpopulation penalty, where if I have a 6th, 7th, or 8th person on my planet of Genis, it gives me an additional population penalty. So the kind of net result of all of this is that or approval becomes a lot harder to control, and especially as you grow bigger and bigger systems where you have a lot more people, you're triggering multiple population penalties, and let's say you have, like here on Wardan, you're filling it out. As soon as you get 3 population on this planet, it's worse than it was before by a substantial margin. And for these kind of big planets over here, like the Arid that used to give -5, as soon as you start filling this thing up, it's got a huge negative approval penalty. So we're talking about approval in 2 parts. So that's kind of overview of the part 1 within the system, so how the populations affect it. The second one is more on the empire level. So this has always kind of been here. So this empire approval and this thing called the number of colonized star systems that the maximum over which you'll get an empire-wide approval penalty, that number has changed a lot. And so it used to be much higher and also a bit more flexible. And when you go over this number, meaning if I have 7 systems and I add my 8th system, then every single system I control gets -10 approval. And this system was in the game before. The numbers have just kind of been changed around a little bit. And approval is now much more punishing. And so having an 8th system gives you -10. A 9th system gives you -20 everywhere. Having 12 systems gives you -50 everywhere, and so on. So this means that as you expand, because if you guys have been a fan of the channel, you know that the main way that I've tried to play Endless Space is to go wide as opposed to tall, to use the 4X kind of terminology. You want to make a lot of systems very quickly and then use those systems to establish a snowball. And this approval penalty really kind of starts to push back on you on that, because the more systems you create, the more approval you start losing. And being ecstatic in Endless Space is a very nice benefit. It gives you on systems both food and influence, and empire-wide, it gives you gold and science. So if your empire is mutinous, it will crater your growth and your economic and scientific work. So then the last thing to talk about with population and approval is what it does to the tech tree. And I want to highlight a couple of techs over here in the empire development side. And that would be this tech here, xenoanthropology, which gives you the booster program, which gives you 1 extra system before triggering expansion disapproval. So instead of 7, this allows you to go to 8. And then the second tech here, cultural invertex, gives you 2 extra, so it goes to 10, and unlocks this newish building, autonomous administration, that came into play just around the time that we were stopping playing, where it gives you an additional 1 system before triggering expansion disapproval, but it costs a ton of industry, 2,200, and 1,000 influence. So the idea here is that late game, you can then start pushing outwards again by building these buildings on your interior core to make them, like, basically once you build this, a system doesn't count against the expansion disapproval, right? Because it's 1 system, and then it builds this building that gives 1 extra system. So the net result from the system is 0. So you can basically, without an approval penalty, if you have these two techs, then you can have 10 systems plus however many autonomous administrations you have with no penalty. So we'll keep that in mind throughout the game. So that may not sound like a huge difference, but just with the way that you play the game, trying to maintain ecstatic at all times to maximize your gold and science and food flow, it impacts the way that we expand a lot. It causes a substantial push back on on the kind of go wide without thinking about it strategy that we used when the game came out. So we're going to have to be a little bit more thoughtful about when and what to colonize. Okay. So next, I think the second most important thing on our strategies and how we play the game are the starting buildings. And so I'm not talking about the ones that we used before, which the main starting buildings that I like to talk about a lot are the Xeno-industrial infrastructure here, which are still fantastic, and the public-private partnerships, or public-privates, still fantastic. But they have substantially buffed these two, cerebral reality and drone network. So without increasing their costs, they're still 160 industry. For drone network, they doubled the effects from 5 food and industry to 10. And then for cerebral, I don't remember, actually, it's been so long, if they increased it from 10 to 15 for each, or if they went from 5 to 15 for each. I think 10 to 15, giving it a 50% boost. But in either case, the reality is now with 15-15, and especially this one at 10-10, these are fantastic early game buildings now. Especially the ability to get a nice bump in food in the early game is fantastic. And for guys like the Lumeris, the cerebral reality, you can see my initial science production from my planet plus galactic headquarters is 16. So this ability, or this building, gives me almost double my scientific output 4 turns into the game, and also increases my gold production, which, as I'm playing Lumeris, is my critical stat in the early game. So it really makes a lot of sense for me to just rush cerebral reality right away, whereas before we would often build a caravel and try to get more explorations going. So, next. Okay, laws, specifically the pacifist and military laws I want to talk about next. So, in the legal thing, let's talk a little bit about the laws. So, Lumeris start as pacifists. They have changed around a lot of the laws and updated them and really overhauled the system. So, it's going to take a bit of experimentation before we kind of figure out what the new overpowered things are, and like really best strategies. But I think that there are 2 big things that I want to make a point about here, which is that it used to be that pacifists got a massive FIDSI bonus for each allied or at peace empire that you had met, and it was really a big bonus, especially with the Republic that the Lumeris start with. And they've completely done away with that. Instead, you just get 1 influence and can force peace when you're at a Cold War, 1 influence per population, and can force peace at a Cold War, neither of which are very exciting abilities. I mean, 1 influence, okay, but not great. And then the level 1 law that you have is a cost reduction of influence for diplomatic things. And yes, they've revamped the diplomatic system so that you can do more things with the AI, but honestly, your interactions with the AI are never that impactful anyway. There's not so much to be gained from them, except when you're exploiting specific things, like the fact that they undervalue their outposts. For example, with the Lumeris, they massively undervalue their outposts in trade, or at least they used to. So I put almost no value on this diplomatic cost reduction. Yeah, so pacifists are terrible now, and then the other one to mention are that militarists are also not so good. Let's scroll down to... we don't have the... There we go. So there used to be a militarist law called Us or Them, which gave additional happiness during wars for having wars, and this was a key way that my brother David used to play the Cravers. And and so this law, so when they changed the population, the approval system originally, they didn't have this us or them, and they got rid of the 20 approval from each active war, because it was just giving such a huge amount of approval. Like, David would have 100 plus 100 approval on all of his places, which would allow him to expand so widely and overcome the penalties from expansion. And so this us or them decree was actually a response to some of our comments, and it was actually David's idea about a bonus approval on home systems that we suggested to the developers and then saw it instituted, where when you conquer home systems, it gives your entire empire a bonus to approval, so that as you're expanding way out, this can actually keep your empire running, which is pretty neat, I think. So this is kind of the new way that approval works in the militarist tree, to try to keep cravers viable. That they've changed the numbers around a little bit on us or them since coming out with it. So I don't know, it feels cool to us because this was, of course they didn't say thank you guys, you came up with it, but this was an idea that we specifically targeted the problem, reached out to the devs, and offered this solution on the forums, and they responded to it. And so it will be cool to see if David can play cravers with us or them, and get them to work. The problem is that it's pretty high up in the tree, so we'll see if, like, by the time he gets this us or them, if it's already too late, because cravers are in a pretty tough state with the approval system right now. Okay. Yeah, so we'll talk about the Lumeris specific stuff related to the laws later. The last law piece that I wanted to point out is more relevant to the Sophons, but I told you that our level 1 law over here, Trusted Broker, minus 5% diplomatic cost, like, ugh, it's wretched, right? Gives you almost nothing. Compare that to the Scientist level 1 law, minus 30% industry cost on all system improvements. This is one of the most broken laws in the game. Like, unbelievably good, since you're spending so much of your time building systems. So I just wanted to throw that out. The industrial ones are okay, not great. New colony rule is a pretty solid one. That 35 approval for 5 turns goes to every system in your empire, so it can really give a nice bump if you're expanding really fast. And you can just kind of go to it for 1 turn, get the new system, and then switch to a different one. Finally, with the laws, they've changed your core laws a little bit to give them clear downsides. So Super Tax Act used to have just like minus 1 approval per person and plus 4 dust. Now it's a much bigger trade-off, because in the early game, you could take the minus 3 or 4 approval for the 16 gold. No question about that. Now the minus 20 approval on systems for 4 extra dust per person, that's a pretty big it's a pretty big hit. And so it becomes much less worth it in the early game. And same for Toys for Boys. So they used to have this as a science penalty, I believe, instead of an industry penalty. But in almost all cases, you would, because if your empire moves up an approval level from, for example, content to ecstatic, you gain a huge boost in science and dust. And it was previously balanced such that Toys for Boys had almost no drawback, because as long as you were not already ecstatic, if you jumped up, you would overcome the penalty, which I think was a 10% science penalty, with the law. 10% negative industry, however, where industry is the single most important stat in the game, is a much bigger penalty. So I'm much less excited, kind of the upshot of all this conversation, I'm much less excited um, about early stage use of laws. They have a place, but it's conditional, and you're going to end up running a lot of time with no laws in your slot. Okay. Thanks for bearing with me on that long discussion. So trade routes, I'm only going to mention briefly. So trade routes were the key to winning basically the game. In the previous version of Endless Space, like you would get your trade route empire going, and then you became an unstoppable juggernaut. They have been nerfed by about a factor of 2, but to my knowledge, they still function mostly the same, and I think they're still going to be very important. So we'll see how that goes once we get there, but from what I've seen with the numbers, trade routes are still going to be important, just slightly less overwhelming than they used to be, where you would reach a point where your snowball would be going so fast that, I don't know if you guys have watched some of my PvP games with David, but we would get to a point where I could be building and upgrading ships by making, I would be making 300,000 dust per turn or something like that before turn 100. And so I don't expect to be able to get to that level anymore, but we'll see. And then the last thing is there was this whole expansion adding bombers and fighters into the game. And this is, I think, a pretty unimportant thing. It took them a long time to implement it, probably because of the graphics. I haven't looked at the graphics yet. The main gameplay advantage is one that's a mechanic that's really tucked away super hard, which is the ability to fire from any lane to any other lane. So they're actually weaker than most guns, but they have the ability to fire from one lane to another effectively, which kind of interesting. And so I think that they might be useful on really big fleets that will destroy the guys ahead of them really fast and then want to help out guys on the opposite side. But I haven't played with them too much yet. But just looking at the numbers, they don't seem super impactful or super important, except with this lane mechanic, which I think is useful sometimes, but often not. Okay, so those are the 5 things that I wanted to go over that I think changed the way that the game is played dramatically. I'm going to pause this video here for just a second, and then we're going to actually start playing some Lumeris.